I swung on to Maple Lane, and a chill seized me, locking my breath in my chest. There, smack in the middle of my perfectly groomed front lawn, sat a folding table draped with a checkered cloth, and behind it stood Karen Matthews, bleach blonde bob gleaming, oversized sunglasses perched like a queen's crown, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. But it wasn't her smug presence that turned my blood to ice. It was the sight of my treasures scattered around her. My vintage record player, a cherished relic from my grandfather, my power drill, a gift from my dad when I bought this house, even the framed photos from our Grand Canyon family vacation last summer. All my belongings were splayed out with little price tags fluttering like some bizarre, twisted garage sale. I slammed on my brakes, nearly inviting a rear-end collision from the car behind me. The driver blared their horn as they swerved past, but I barely registered it, my mind reeling at the surreal chaos unfolding on my property. I'd been gone just 5 days, a business conference in Chicago, and somehow this woman had transformed my home into a bargain bin. Tires crunching gravel with a vengeance, I yanked into my driveway and leapt from my car. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, storming toward Karen, who was mid-haggle with an elderly couple over what looked like my grandmother's antique silver tea set, a family heirloom worth more in heart than the measly sum she'd scrawled on that tag. Sensing the brewing storm, the couple mumbled apologies and shuffled back to their car. But Karen? She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked almost eager, like she'd been itching for this showdown. "Excuse me, but who are you?" she purred, her voice laced with fake honey that couldn't quite hide the venom underneath, her hand already. "Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontations with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel," already reaching for her phone, manicured nails. Clicking against the screen as she dialed 911, "Yes, I need to report an intruder. At 325 Maple Lane, he's trying to disrupt the Homeowners Association sanctioned property clearance and becoming quite aggressive. Please hurry." The casual way she described me as an intruder in my own home left me speechless, my mouth hanging open in disbelief as she continued her fabricated emergency call. I had moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakage Estates almost 2 years ago, drawn by the mature trees, spacious yards, and promise of peaceful living away from the hustle and bustle of downtown. The real estate agent had emphasized the lack of a formal homeowners association as a selling point. No restrictive covenants limiting what color I could paint my shutters, no monthly fees patting someone else's pockets, no committees to approve my landscaping choices after living in a condo with draconian rules about everything from holiday decorations to acceptable window treatments. The freedom of owning a single-family home without oversight had been irresistible. The first few months had been everything I'd hoped for. Neighbors who waved as they collected their male weekend barbecues that filled the air with delicious aromas and a general sense of community that reminded me of the small town where I grew up. I had spent weekends planting a vegetable garden in the backyard, installing bird feeders that attracted a colorful array of local species, and slowly making the house my own with each personal touch. For the first time since moving to the city for my job, 5 years earlier, I finally felt at home. Then I met Karen Matthews, and everything changed. Karen had lived in Oakage Estates for over 15 years, according to Mrs. Rodriguez, my kindly next-door neighbor, who had welcomed me with homemade empanadas and warnings about that Matthews woman. Karen had moved into the neighborhood with her husband shortly after they married, but he had left under mysterious circumstances. About 7 years ago since then, she had channeled all her energy into what Mrs. Rodriguez called neighborhood business, which seemed to primarily consist of monitoring everyone else's lives with microscopic attention to detail. Karen had attempted to establish an official homeowners association 3 separate times over the years, but could never gather enough signatures from residents who saw through her thinly veiled attempt to gain authority over the neighborhood. Undeterred by these failures, Karen had simply decided to act as if the HOA existed anyway, distributing handmade violation notices for everything from improper lawn maintenance to unapproved holiday decorations. My first encounter with Karen had come just 2 weeks after moving in, when I found a printed notice tucked into my mailbox claiming I was in violation of Section 4.3 of the Neighborhood Covenant. For having my garbage bins visible from the street on non-collection days, I had politely explained that I wasn't aware of any official HOA, which she confirmed with a dismissive wave of her hand, informing me that they were in the process of formalizing, but that all residents were still expected to comply with community standards when I declined. Her invitation to join her non-existent organization and pay the outrageous dues she had calculated based on my property square footage, I became her primary target. Over the months that followed, Karen escalated her campaign against me. My mailbox regularly contained notices for infractions like excessive bird feeder activity and non-approved wind chime resonance. She would photograph my house at odd hours, documenting supposed violations with the dedication of an investigative journalist. Other neighbors advised me to ignore her, explaining that Karen's behavior was a well-known nuisance, but ultimately harmless. She's lonely since her husband left. Mrs. Rodriguez had explained with a shrug. Creating drama gives her purpose. I had taken their advice, collecting her notices in a folder labeled Karen's Fantasyland and continuing with my life, but this, selling my personal belongings without permission, this was beyond anything I could have anticipated. I had left town the previous Monday for a sales conference that was supposed to last until Saturday. My company had recently promoted me to regional manager, and this conference was my first opportunity to network with other managers from across the country. I had prepared meticulously for the trip, arranging for Mrs. Rodriguez to collect my mail and water the potted plants on my porch. I had hidden a spare key beneath the stone turtle near my garden, just in case of emergencies. Never did I imagine that my precautions would enable someone like Karen to take advantage of my absence as I stepped through my open front gate that Friday afternoon. Having decided to return a day early after the final conference sessions were cancelled, I had immediately noticed something was off. The decorative lanterns that usually frame my walkway were missing, and the welcome mat that had been a housewarming gift for my sister was nowhere to be seen. At first I had assumed it might be petty theft. Perhaps someone had swiped a few items from my porch, an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in even the safest neighborhoods. But then I noticed the garage lights glowing through the side windows, and the muffled sound of what seemed to be vintage 80s music drifting from my backyard. Cautiously, I had made my way around the side of the house, wondering if perhaps Mrs. Rodriguez had decided to use my garage. For some reason, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my lawn, making the familiar landscape of my property seem suddenly strange and vaguely threatening. I noticed my garden hose had been neatly coiled, something I never bothered to do, and several of my potted plants had been rearranged into a more aesthetically pleasing formation. The sense of someone else having touched and altered my personal space sent an uncomfortable shiver down my spine even before I discovered the full extent of the invasion. What I found instead was the back door propped open with one of my own door's stops, and cardboard boxes stacked on my patio, each labeled in unfamiliar handwriting. Kitchen items, 5 each, electronics prices as marked books, and media, 3 for 10. Some boxes were already empty, their contents presumably already sold to unsuspecting neighbors who had no idea they were purchasing stolen goods. I picked up a pricing sheet that had been paperclipped to one of the boxes, recognizing with growing outrage that it was printed on my own stationery Karen had apparently helped herself to my home office supplies as well. My confusion had quickly turned to disbelief as I followed the sound of laughter and conversation to my front yard, where I discovered Karen presiding over what appeared to be a fully organized estate sale of my estate now, as I stood facing her across my own lawn while she calmly reported me as an intruder to emergency services. I felt a surge of anger, unlike anything I had experienced before. My hands trembled with the effort of maintaining my composure. As I watched this woman, this virtual stranger, speak so confidently about my life, my property, and my supposed absence, as if she had any right to such information. The casual ownership with which she referred to my home made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about the violation of my property, it was the violation of my privacy, my security, and my sense of belonging. In my own neighborhood, several shoppers continued to browse through tables of my belongings, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding. An older man was examining my college textbooks, which I'd kept for sentimental reasons. A young couple was testing the buttons on my coffee maker, the expensive one I'd splurged on as a gift to myself. After my promotion last year, each item they touched felt like another invasion, another small piece of my life being handled and judged and potentially carried away by people who had no idea they were participating in theft.
Hang up the phone, Karen,
I demanded, taking a step toward her, my voice lower and steadier than I expected. Given the hurricane of emotions swirling inside me, you know exactly who I am and you're selling my belongings without permission. That's theft. Put down the phone. Right now, or I'll be the one calling the police. Karen raised a finger, signaling me to wait, while she finished her conversation with the 911 dispatcher. Yes, he's a white male, approximately 35, becoming increasingly hostile. I fear for my safety and that of the other HOA members conducting this authorized property clearance. The homeowner is away until tomorrow, and this individual is claiming to be him. But we've had issues with squatters in the area recently. She nodded to herself as if receiving confirmation. Thank you. Yes, officers are on the way. Wonderful. I'll remain on the line as I stood facing Karen across my front lawn. The reality of what she had done began to sink in more deeply. This wasn't just a random act of theft or a momentary lapse in judgment. The level of planning required to organize an entire yard sale of someone else's possessions suggested something far more disturbing. She had systematically violated every boundary between us, transforming from an annoying neighbor into something much more sinister. I found myself wondering what else she might have done during her unauthorized visits to my home, as she tried on my clothes, slept in my bed, read through my personal correspondence. The possibilities made my skin crawl. The small crowd that had gathered was growing by the minute as neighbors texted and called each other about the unfolding drama. I recognized some faces from casual encounters. The man who walked his golden retriever past my house every morning. The woman who had complimented my holiday decorations last Christmas. The teenage boy who mowed lawns in the summer. Others were complete strangers to me, yet they were now witnesses to one of the most invasive violations I had ever experienced. I felt oddly exposed, as if Karen's actions had not only stripped my home of its contents, but had also somehow made my private life a public spectacle. Through the haze of my anger and disbelief, I became aware of whispered conversations around me. She's finally gone too far. Someone murmured. I always knew there was something not right about her. Said another, it dawned on me that I was not Karen's first victim, merely the first to catch her in the act. The realization sent a chill through me, despite the warm spring afternoon. How long had the neighborhood been enabling her behavior through their silence and inaction? How many other violations had gone unchallenged because it was easier to avoid confrontation? Everyone I called out, turning to address the small crowd that had formed. "This woman has broken into my home and is selling my possessions without permission. There is no legitimate homeowners association in Oakridge Estates, and even if there were, it would not give anyone the right to enter a private residence and remove property. What's happening here is illegal." A few neighbors nodded in agreement, while others looked uncertainly between Karen and me, clearly confused about who to believe. Karen's face flushed red with anger, though her saccharine smile remained firmly in place. "I am conducting an authorized clearance of abandoned property to fund community improvements," she announced loudly, covering the phone's microphone momentarily. "As acting president of the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association, I have the authority to liquidate abandoned property when necessary, especially when said property violates our community standards." The actual homeowner was notified 3 times, via official correspondence, that their continued violations would result in remedial action. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Abandoned? I've been gone for 5 days on a business trip. And those official notices you're referring to are pieces of paper you print on your home computer with no legal standing whatsoever. I pulled out my phone, quickly scrolling, to find the photos I had taken of the more ridiculous violation notices I'd received over the months you cited me for excessive bird feeder activity because, and I quote, "non-native birds are disrupting the ecological balance of the neighborhood." That's not a real thing, Karen. Some of the onlookers chuckled at this, and I could see Karen's composure begin to crack slightly. Her free hand clenched into a fist at her side, and her smile became more of a grimace. The homeowner was given ample opportunity to comply with community standards and chose not to. This property clearance was approved by the board after thorough deliberation. The fact that she was still maintaining this fiction, even as her lies became more apparent, was almost impressive in its audacity. What board? Karen, name one other person on this supposed HOA board. I challenged, knowing full well that no such group existed before she could respond. The distinctive sound of police sirens cut through the afternoon air, growing louder as they approached. "Our street?" Karen's expression shifted to one of triumph, as if the arrival of law enforcement somehow validated her actions within minutes. A patrol car pulled up in front of my house, and 2 officers stepped out. One was older, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen it all during his years on the force. His younger partner looked barely out of the academy, his uniform still crisp and his expression alert, as he surveyed the unusual scene before them. Karen immediately moved to intercept them, her phone still pressed to her ear as she waved them over with her free hand. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she began, the picture of a concerned citizen. "I'm Karen Matthews, president of the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association. We're conducting an authorized property clearance, and this individual," she gestured dismissively in my direction, "arrived, making aggressive claims and disrupting our community function. He insists he's the homeowner, but the actual resident isn't due back until tomorrow, according to our records." The older officer, whose name plate identified him as Officer Daniels, nodded. "Politely but non-committally, and you are, sir?" he asked, turning to me with a professional neutrality that offered no hints as to whether he believed Karen's version of events. "Michael Anderson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my mounting frustration. "I live here at 325 Maple Lane. I own this house, and I never authorized anyone to enter my property or sell my belongings. I was away on a business trip and returned early. To find this, I gestured to the yard sale sprawled across my lawn. Officer Daniels nodded again. "Do you have any identification that shows this is your residence, Mr. Anderson?" "Of course," I replied, reaching for my wallet. "I have my driver's license with this address, and I can show you the deed to the property and mortgage statements. If necessary, they're inside. But more importantly, I have security footage that will show exactly how this happened." This last part wasn't entirely true, yet I did have a doorbell camera that I'd installed after the second or third of Karen's violations had appeared, hoping to catch her in the act of delivering them. I hadn't checked the footage yet, but I was almost certain it would have captured Karen's unauthorized entry to my property. Karen's triumphant expression faltered slightly at the mention of security footage, but she quickly recovered. Officer, as HOA president, I have certain authorities granted by the community covenant, including access to properties that pose a persistent violation risk. All proper procedures were followed. I assure you the younger officer, whose name plate reads, looked between Karen and me with growing confusion. Even if there is an HOA with those kinds of rules, they would still need to go through legal channels before entering someone's home or removing property. Do you have documentation authorizing this action? Court orders. Written permission from the homeowner? Karen smile tightened. Well, not as such. No, but we have internal documentation of the violations and the board vote approving this measure after multiple notices went unanswered. She reached into a leather portfolio resting on the folding table and produced a stack of papers that I recognized as copies of her homemade violation notices, complete with clip art of a gavel. At the top of each page, Officer Daniels took the papers and flipped through them with an expression that grew increasingly skeptical. I peered over his shoulder at several of the documents, noting with growing amazement the elaborate fiction Karen had constructed. Each violation notice included references to non-existent municipal codes, fabricated precedents from other neighborhoods, and detailed descriptions of supposed infractions that range from the petty improper mailbox height 3.5 in above regulation to the absurd unauthorized wind chime, tonality disrupting neighborhood sonic harmony. The meticulous record keeping would have been impressive if it weren't so utterly delusional. These don't appear to be legally binding documents, Mum. Officer Daniels observed, his tone neutral, but his eyes reflecting a growing understanding of what he was dealing with. They're not notarized, they don't cite specific municipal codes that exist in our jurisdiction, and they're not issued by any recognized authority that I'm familiar with. He handed the stack back to Karen, whose face had begun to reen with indignation, the first cracks appearing in her carefully maintained facade of official. I assure you, Officer, these notices follow the template recommended by the National Association of Homeowners Associations. Karen insisted, the slight tremor in her voice betraying her growing uncertainty. I had never heard of such an organization, and judging by Officer Daniels' raised eyebrow, neither had he were a self-regulating community entity with the authority to enforce standards that maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, Mr. Anderson. If you don't mind, Officer Daniels suggested, gesturing toward my front door. We'll need to verify your identity and ownership of the property, and then we can sort this situation out. Of course, I agreed, relief washing over me at finally being taken seriously as we moved toward the house. Karen attempted to follow, but Officer Brooks politely but firmly asked her to remain where she was while they conducted their initial investigation. The look of outrage on her face as she was excluded from our conversation was almost worth the entire ordeal inside my home. The evidence of Karen's intrusion was even more apparent. Drawers stood open in the kitchen, empty spaces marked the walls where artwork had been removed, and various cabinets throughout the house had been rummaged through with little attempt to maintain order. My refrigerator had been cleaned out, the contents either discarded or, more disturbingly, rearranged according to some organizational system, not my own. In the living room, furniture had been slightly repositioned, my couch pushed back an extra foot. From the coffee table, throw pillows arranged in a pattern I would never have chosen. It was as if Karen had not only stolen my belongings, but had attempted to remake my living space according to her own preferences. Most unsettling of all was my bedroom, where dresser drawers had been methodically emptied of certain items. More expensive watches and cufflinks were missing, and my closet had been partially reorganized with empty hangers where my designer suits had once hung on my nightstand. A framed photograph of my late parents had been removed from its frame, the silver frame now sporting a price tag, while the precious photograph lay carelessly on the surface beside it. This final indignity sent a wave of nausea through me. Even my most personal, irreplaceable possessions had not been sacred to this woman. Officer Daniels documented the scene with a small notepad while I located my important papers, deed, mortgage statements, insurance documents, all clearly identifying me. As the rightful owner of the property, he photographed areas where the most obvious theft had occurred, asking occasional questions about what had been there before and the approximate value of the missing items. "How do you think she gained entry to your home, Mr. Anderson?" Officer Brooks asked, as he examined a back window for signs of forced entry. "I had a spare key hidden outside for emergencies." I admitted feeling foolish now for having been so trusting under a decorative stone turtle near the garden. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, knows about it in case I get locked out, but I suppose Karen must have either seen me use it at some point or noticed me showing it to Mrs. Rodriguez. Officer Daniels nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. People have a false sense of security in neighborhoods like this. Now you mentioned security footage. I led them to my home office where I accessed the cloud storage for my doorbell camera on my computer. The interface loaded slowly each second of waiting, intensifying my anxiety about what we might find or not find. I had installed the camera primarily as a deterrent after a series of package thefts in the area last year, never imagining it would be used to document something like this as the footage began to load. I found myself silently thanking my past self for not skimping on the cloud storage upgrade that preserved recordings for up to 30 days. Sure enough, the footage from early Tuesday morning clearly showed Karen approaching my front door with an envelope, presumably another of her notices. She had knocked, waited briefly while glancing at her watch as if timing the appropriate interval, then glanced around furtively before making her way around the side of the house. Her movements were purposeful and practiced, suggesting this was not the first time she had ventured beyond the public F-facing areas of someone's property. The camera's motion detection had activated again about 15 minutes later, capturing Karen returning to the front of the house this time with my spare key in hand and a satisfied expression on her face. She tested it in the front door lock, nodding to herself when it worked smoothly, then returned the key to her pocket rather than to its hiding place. This calculated theft of my key sent another wave of violation through mesh had never intended. This to be a one-time intrusion she had been planning for repeated access to my home long after I returned. As we continued to review the footage, a disturbing pattern emerged. Additional recordings from throughout the week showed her making multiple trips to and from my house, gradually removing items and setting up the yard sale. What began as small, easily concealed objects in her oversized purse escalated to larger items carried openly to her car and eventually to a rented moving dolly being used to transport my furniture across the lawn. With each visit, her confidence seemed to grow, her movements becoming less furtive and more entitled. By Thursday, she was directing a small group of people, presumably her HOA board members, in categorizing and pricing my possessions as if conducting a legitimate estate liquidation. Well, that seems pretty definitive, Officer Daniels said, leaning back from the computer screen. She clearly entered your property without authorization and removed your belongings without permission. He exchanged a glance with his partner before continuing. "We'll need to get statements from both of you, and you'll need to itemize what was taken for the report. Given the evidence, we're looking at charges of breaking and entering theft and filing a false police report at minimum, as the crowd of onlookers had grown considerably, with nearly half the neighborhood now gathered to witness Karen's comeuppance. Some had brought out lawn chairs, settling in for what had apparently become the most interesting neighborhood event in recent memory. Children peeked curiously from behind their parents' legs, while teenagers recorded the scene on their phones, no doubt sharing the drama with their social media followers in real time. The atmosphere had an almost festival-like quality, with neighbors who normally only interacted in passing now engaged in animated discussions about Karen's years of petty tyranny. Karen herself remained by her folding table, arms crossed defensively, as she engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with another officer who had arrived. While we were inside, her normally perfect posture had begun to sag, and the confidence that had radiated from her earlier was notably diminished. Even her immaculate appearance had started to deteriorate, her blonde bob slightly disheveled, her mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes, and a fine sheen of nervous perspiration visible on her forehead. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen Matthews looked vulnerable, and the sight was both satisfying and strangely disquieting as we approached. I could hear Karen attempting to salvage her story. "There must be some misunderstanding, officer. As HOA president, I was simply acting in the best interest of the community. The property had become an eyesore, and we have standards to maintain in Oakage Estates." Mrs. Matthews, Officer Daniels interrupted firmly, his professional demeanor tinged with an unmistakable note of authority that seemed to cut through Karen's fabrications like a knife. "We verified that Mr. Anderson is indeed the legal owner of this property, and we have video evidence of you entering his home without permission and removing his belongings. Furthermore, there appears to be no legally established homeowners association for this neighborhood registered with the county. Not only that, but we've confirmed with municipal records that no application for such an organization has ever been filed for Oakage Estates." The systematic dismantling of Karen's carefully constructed fiction seemed to hit her with physical force. Each point the officer made caused her shoulders to slump a fraction more, the imperious posture that had defined her neighborhood presence for years, gradually crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence, still like a cornered animal. She made one last desperate attempt to maintain her facade of legitimacy. "There must be some mistake in the records," she insisted, her voice taken on a shrill quality I hadn't heard before. "The HOA is in the process of formal registration. We operate under a community covenant that all residents agree to upon moving in." Mr. Anderson was provided with this information when he purchased the property. She reached again for her portfolio, her fingers trembling slightly as she rifled through the papers within, presumably searching for this fictional document that would vindicate her actions. "Actually," came a voice from the crowd, "there has never been a legitimate HOA in Oakage Estates." Mr. Harrington, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, stepped forward. "Karen has been trying to establish one for years, but she's never been able to get enough signatures to make it official. Those notices she hands out aren't worth the paper they're printed on." Several other neighbors murmured in agreement, emboldened by Mr. Harrington's statement to share their own experiences. With Karen's unauthorized enforcement of non-existent rules, Mrs. Rodriguez, my kindly next-door neighbor, approached the officers with her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Karen has been leaving these notices at everyone's homes for years," she explained, her accent thickening slightly with emotion. "Most of us just ignore them because they're not real, but she seems to have targeted Michael particularly harshly since he moved in." I never imagined she would go this far, though. As the chorus of testimonials grew, Karen's composure began to crumble entirely. Her face flushed a deep red and her hands trembled visibly as she clutched her portfolio to her chest like a shield. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "I have been the only one maintaining standards in this neighborhood for 15 years. Without my oversight, property values would have plummeted long ago. Everything I've done has been for the benefit of the community officer." Brooks approached Karen with a decidedly less sympathetic expression than before. "Mrs. Matthews, we're going to need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement based on the evidence and witness testimonies you're facing. Serious charges. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The reality of her situation seemed to finally penetrate Karen's armor of self-righteousness. "You can't be serious," she protested, taking a step backward. "I was providing a community service, these people." She gestured wildly. "At the gathered neighbors should be thanking me for maintaining the integrity of Oakridge Estates," Mrs. Matthews. Officer Daniels said sternly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he continued reading her rights, Officer Brooks gently but firmly secured handcuffs around Karen's wrists, her portfolio falling to the ground and spilling its contents across the London of fabricated violation notices, spreadsheets tracking supposed infractions by address, and meticulously labeled maps of the neighborhood with houses marked in various colors according to some inscrutable system of Karen's own devising. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Karen was escorted to the patrol car, her indignant protest growing increasingly desperate. "This is a mistake. I am an authorized community representative. You'll all regret this when your property values collapse without proper oversight." The slam of the police car door finally cut off her tirade, leaving an almost surreal quiet in its wake. Officer Daniels remained behind to complete his report and helped me begin the process of cataloguing the items Karen had attempted to sell. Neighbors who had purchased things unaware of the illegitimacy of the sale began approaching me, apologetically offering to return the items they had bought. "Mr. Quing" by Anne Jenkins from across the street shamefacedly returned my grandfather's fishing tackle box, while the Wilson family from the corner house brought back several of my kitchen appliances. Even people I had never met before came forward with items they had purchased, expressing their shock and sympathy over what had happened as the afternoon wore on. A strange sense of community began to emerge from the chaos. Neighbors, who had previously only exchanged polite waves, began introducing themselves properly, offering help in returning my scattered belongings to their rightful places inside my home. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a team to help clean up the yard and dismantle the impromptu sale, while Mr. Harrington shared stories of Karen's previous schemes that had never escalated to quite this level of audacity. She once tried to charge me a tree height variance fee when my oak grew taller than her ridiculous 30-foot limit. Mr. Harrington chuckled, shaking his head at the memory, as he helped me reorganize my bookshelf when I refused to pay. She left pruning equipment on my doorstep for weeks, as if I was going to cut down a 100-year-old oak because she decided it was too tall. Mrs. Rodriguez carefully wrapping my grandmother's teacups that had been recovered from a neighbor 3 streets over had her own tales to share. Last summer she measured the height of my tomato plants with a ruler and left a notice saying they exceeded the permitted vegetable elevation for front yard gardens. I didn't even have a front yard garden. My tomatoes were in the backyard, but she had been peering over fences again. Each story revealed a pattern of invasive behavior that had been normalized through years of collective inaction. The neighborhood had adapted to Karen's eccentricities, rather than confronting them, allowing her sense of entitlement to grow unchecked, until it had culminated in the extraordinary violation of my home. Yet there was no malice in their revelations, only a shared sense of relief that Karen's reign of petty tyranny had finally reached its end by sunset. Most of my possessions had been returned, though Officer Daniels had warned me that some items might never be recovered. The yard sale had apparently been quite busy in the morning hours before. My return with many purchases made by people from outside our immediate neighborhood who would be difficult to trace. He had provided me with a case number and instructions for filing an insurance claim for anything that remained missing as well. As information about the legal proceedings that would follow, Karen would likely face multiple charges and I would need to appear in court to testify about the incident as the last of the neighbors departed and the patrol cars pulled away. I stood, alone on my front porch surveying the now quiet street. The sense of violation lingered. Knowing that Karen had invaded my private space and handled my possessions. But there was also a strange sense of closure. Her reign of petty tyranny had finally reached its inevitable conclusion, exposed as the hollow power grab. It had always been the following Tuesday, after spending the weekend restoring order to my home and changing every lock I returned from work, to find a familiar-looking envelope. Tucked into my mailbox, my heart sank as I recognized the distinctive clip art letterhead of Karen's fictitious HOA. Somehow, despite everything that had happened, she had managed to deliver one more notice while out on bail. I should have been furious, should have immediately called Officer Daniels to report this obvious harassment, but instead I found myself curiously numb as I opened the envelope. The violation notice inside was printed on the same cheap paper as all the others, but there was something different about this one, a certain meticulousness to the formatting and attention to detail that suggested Karen had spent considerable time crafting this particular message. The letterhead included not just the usual clip art gavel, but an elaborate border of intricate design, and the font had been changed from the standard Times New Roman to something more elegant and flowing. The violation cited was simply listed as improper attitude, with a detailed description below that. Included specific dates and times of my supposed infractions against community harmony. At the bottom, in red ink that seemed to have been applied with particular force, was a handwritten note. Consider this a final warning. The pressure of the pen had nearly torn through the paper, in places the letters jagged and sharp compared to the carefully formatted text above. I stood in my driveway, the notice trembling slightly in my hand, as the implications of those 4 words slowly sank in. This wasn't over for Karen. This would never be over.